Another Embodied Love episode. We are so happy to be back. Today we're going to be talking about what probably is the most unknown yet most common sexual epidemic there is in the world. That's correct, in the world. What do you think that might be?
Well, it is definitely around numbness and dissociation and also the quest for pleasure because it's so prevalent, it's really, really interesting what happens. There's this need, this desire, like, I need to feel something, I need to feel something. So this episode is very exciting for me. We have a lot of clients we've helped with this.
Yeah.
And I don't like how the sex therapy industry deals with this. I don't like how the medical industry deals with this. And there are solutions, but they're not really known. So we're really excited to bring those to you today.
And most of you might think that the biggest thing out there that people struggle with is pain. And I would say that, yes, there are some major statistics out there. I think it's 1 out of 3 women, the last time they had sex, experienced pain. And then it's 1 out of 10 women suffer chronically from pain. These are studies that have had over 6,000 people done by the Kinsey Institute. There's another one that was done out of the UK, over 7,000. They didn't believe these numbers. They actually had to do them over again.
There's no way this is not happening.
And they believe those are underreported. So imagine what it's like then for somebody who simply can't feel.
Yeah, well, we actually have the pleasure to work with a lot of different people, and a person that we were working with fairly recently in the last few years, she came forward, she said, I thought I healed my sexual dysfunction, but then when I started working with your technology, I realized I actually have a lot of vulvar and vaginal pain during sex. And she had not realized that. And she herself is all about optimization and health and wellness. So don't worry if you are a very aware person, you just aware of your whole situation, your life, your money, everything else. But this piece you're not that aware of. It is so common. So in this episode, we're also going to help you discover numbness specifically we can't feel, so how do we become aware of that?
And also numbness too doesn't have to mean you don't feel anything. It might be that you're just kind of feeling pressure, or as we get into optimization, it's the ability to actually feel so much more. And I think that's a piece that's really incredible, because essentially you're not just born with a certain amount of sensation you can have. You can literally condition yourself to feel more and more and more throughout your entire life. So that means that it doesn't just happen, when you're young and supposedly beautiful on the outside, but instead that this is something that grows throughout a lifetime. And in these cases, people well into the latter years of their life are experiencing more pleasure than they ever have.
Yes. So, and then the second part of this conversation that we absolutely have to address is this experience of dissociation. So what we mean by that is when an experience is happening and you are not there. Your awareness is elsewhere. You're not feeling your body. You're not even sometimes situationally aware. That's quite an incredible thing, and that seems to happen quite a bit. And so we're going to go over why that does happen and what you can do in order to reassociate yourself with your body and with pleasure.
So let's go a little bit into then what are the reasons of why and how this happens.
Yeah, I like to call them the culprits.
Culprits, all right.
Because they are culprits. There are many things that can happen. Perhaps someone grew up in an abusive home, whether or not they were personally abused, but in an abusive space can cause a person to numb out and dissociate.
So that could be an abuse that's done to them, or observing abuses that are happening.
Exactly.
There also typically can be a lot of things that will happen when witnessing. If for some reason you felt an arousal from that, but then later on you realize that this wasn't something that's right, you start to disassociate. And then from there, it's not just a physical thing, it's actually a psychological culprit as well.
Yeah, so we're going to go through all the culprits. In the second half, like the longer part of the podcast, we're really going to get into more details of why this happens and how to handle it. But for now, let's just go through all the culprits because there's quite a few of them. Trauma of any kind. So whether it's a sexual trauma, you've been physically abused, emotionally abused, maybe it's a bad surgery even, and anything traumatic that has happened to you can cause numbness and dissociation.
So that's one on the physical side. One on the psychological side as well could be literally the culture within which you're raised.
Yeah, being shamed.
That then comes into either family or just simply even on a more national level. Could be a religious thing as well. That causes a lot of shame in the body. And so then you again try and create that separation from your pleasure. You judge it one way or another. And then the body will actually help you out by shutting it down, because sometimes you actually need that at the moment to be more safe.
I actually remember a moment, this is to talk about porn, and it has some benefits, of course, but there's a lot of things that can happen with porn that can cause numbness and dissociation. So that's what we're addressing here. But I remember I think I was 8 years old, and I went to visit my friend, and the parents weren't home, and the older brother, who was a teenager, was home. And for a joke, he decided to leave a porno tape playing on the TV. So when I walked into the living room and I saw this, I remember my body going into shock, because that I didn't expect to see that, and two, I didn't understand it. Why is this on TV? Why is it happening in the middle of the day? Why is it happening now? Or what's going to happen to me? So there was all these things that rose up. So sometimes for young kids, being exposed to things that are too explicit too fast can also cause a form of dissociation when the topic of sexuality comes around.
I also had a family member similarly was just watching daytime TV, and then boop, comes up, I think it was probably one of those like murder mysteries, and there was a rape scene that happened. Nothing explicit in the sense of showing nudity, but just showing how those two people were interacting. And my family member, it created a lot of distress in his body, which then led to a ton of questions towards his parents, and then for a long time having some awkwardness around sex, sexuality, affection, and intimacy as being shown.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. There's tons of bad sexual education in the world. So if you adopt some of those bad practices or start to kind of identify with some of those misleading ideas, it can actually lead to numbness and to dissociating. An example of that would be the encouragement of everyone to use vibrators. Now, there's a time and place for those things, but also there's a time and place where they're not that great, especially when you're developing your bodies. So sex education, when it's maybe done in a way that's not the right timing.
Well, if it gets prescriptive, saying this is the way to do it, and it takes you away from actually feeling more of your body, and that you actually start to become, like, for instance, pushing yourself with a vibrator to overwhelm yourself into orgasm typically is going to then need more and more extreme types of touch, extreme types of stimulation and vibration specifically, which brings you into your sympathetic nervous system, which then is a very different way than activating this relaxed arousal and having orgasms that come from the parasympathetic nervous system, which relies more on light touch and deeper pressure.
Well, essentially what we want to get across here is that you can train yourself into numbness and dissociation. And we want to reverse that training today. So we'll be sharing a lot of ways in which you can, if that's true for you, work with your body in different ways to kind of bring back or that reassociation.
Well, and that training, I think, brings up probably the biggest point around numbness, because it does slowly creep up on you. And now this isn't numbness by certain definitions where, yes, you would actually be able to see that the nerves are being stimulated and that the brain's firing off. So it wouldn't be numbness in that sense, but you wouldn't be noticing or aware of these more subtle sensations. And this is the piece here that gets most people, is that they're kind of small things that you do to yourself over and over again over time period. And then it has this added effect that then will literally bring the body out of sensing, which then normally you're going to try and go into more and more extremes to get that sensation to come back alive. But then what ends up happening is that can then start to actually create damage to the tissues and start to register as chronic pain. And a lot of times what you'll be told is, oh, this is just in your head. Because there's no physical symptoms that you can look at, especially externally.
It's just in your head.
And that's the problem. The problem is that it's in your head.
It's not in the body.
And you're not in your body.
And so if you've ever been told that by a doctor, oh, it's just in your head, have a laugh. Like, it's sad, but have a laugh, because it's just a misinformed person who doesn't really understand how pleasure anatomy really works. So in our second half, we're definitely going to give you some tools that you can use that can bring the in your head part back down into the body, into sensing, into your sensuality, and into even sensing from the inner spaces of your body.
So now that we've named a couple of the culprits out there.
I'm not ready yet.
Oh, you want to keep going into the
I have
culprits?
a few more.
All right, let's keep going then. I like this.
One is really important that I've seen a lot in my women's groups is micro betrayals. So every time that you acquiesce to being sexual when you're actually a no is a form of betraying your body. Every time you maybe push a tampon into yourself when you're not ready or it's uncomfortable, they're called micro betrayals. And if you do that over and over a lifetime, the body does shut down at some point and just doesn't trust you anymore. So part of what we'll discuss also a little bit later is how can you rebuild this trust? It is so important, this trust. Trust in yourself, in your body, is what actually allows you to have so much more sensation and pleasure.
Yeah. Well, that brings up the other one is you're typically just using your body to get some kind of effect, which is normally an orgasm, so that you can just fall asleep without actually feeling into yourself during that experience. Then guess what happens? In the same way you'd shut down to a date that did that to you, your body's going to eventually start to just go into kind of robot mode and not feel that much. And then you'll have to, and I think this happens a lot with guys, go to more and more extreme, kind of like using a death grip to be able to get yourself off.
Yes.
And then eventually you start to even disassociate emotionally.
Also in childhood, if you interrupt a child's erotic innocence, this can impact numbness and dissociation. So if that happened to you, know that it's not a forever thing. You can re-imprint your body. But interfering with erotic innocence is a huge part, because that developmental stage, especially those first 5 to 7 years, it's really important that children have the freedom to explore their body and sensation without being shamed, but also without being abused. So we need to be really protective of that innocence and give boundaries to the kids.
This is a huge point, and I think so many parents want to and need to know more about this. Briefly go into a little bit more. What is erotic innocence?
So we're all born with it. So essentially, innocence, if you translate it very loosely, it's in no sense. It doesn't have to make sense. You're not saying something's right or wrong, good or bad. You're interfacing with an experience without adding judgment value to it. So I'll touch my elbow. I'm like, oh, that's a curious feeling. I touch my nose. That's a curious feeling. I touch my genital. That's a curious feeling. I touch my knee. That's a curious feeling.
Go to the bathroom.
So there's no, exactly. There's just an innocent way of sensing into one's physicality.
It's a natural process of self-discovery by following one's pleasure. And when there's that disconnect, because maybe a parent or someone else comes in and then places the shame or judgment that they have themselves on what that must mean when a child is then just joyfully exploring themselves, that creates that void, that tear between, or the dissonance between, oh, this is wrong in my head and this feels good in my body.
Almost, I would say 80% of my clients can remember a moment when they were kids and they were just really enjoying their body, and then something impact from the outside happened, whether it was a sibling, a parent, a family member, a friend, doesn't matter. Someone caught them and was like, that's disgusting, dirty, horrible, yucky, or they were punished in some way, or soap put, in their mouth, or, one little girl had her hands tied behind her back for the whole day, these horrible tortures. And so that instantly creates a sense of trauma, and then you associate good feelings in your own body with something pretty horrific. So again, all of those things, unfortunately, seems to be very commonplace. Thankfully, we can re-imprint ourselves and start to have that reassociation, bring sensation back, and over time, actually experience safety, delight, and pleasure in our bodies.
Here's another big one, and you might not know the term spectatoring, where that is, you're literally, if you go watch a sporting event and you're a spectator watching the event happen as opposed to being in the event and actually being connected to the game. This happens a lot during sex. If you have ever started to think about, oh, how am I looking? Or what's the perspective from the outside? Or what is my partner thinking about me? And you do not feel yourself in those moments, you are actually going into a form of disassociation. This is very common. I think this is something that we also want to emphasize.
Yeah.
This is so common. If you're kind of noticing, oh, I do this a lot, or I do this just a little bit, it's extremely common. So this isn't to be placing like a judgment on oneself.
Absolutely not.
This is more just to create more awareness from a felt state.
The reason we wanted to talk about this is it is extremely common. Nearly all of our clients have a degree of this, and the beauty and the excitement and the hopefulness, the return of hope, the return of innocence, the return of
Curiosity, self-discovery.
I'm getting goosebumps.
You felt them too.
Yeah, I definitely felt them. It's so beautiful to watch a human being have that reclamation of their bodies and their pleasure. So that's why we wanted to share this, so that it's not just isolated to our private clients, but that also the public can have access to this information.
Here's another one that's a little bit associated as well with the spectator, and I think it happens in an even more subtle way, is that a lot of times when we get to, let's say, our teenage years, our bodies are starting to change, and we're noticing people are looking at us differently. Or I have dated several models where they really cannot feel themselves because they're so used to being looked at from the outside that we begin to, and what I'm going into, have this very strong affinity to experiencing the world just through our eyes and through the visuals, which is another aspect of pornography, that if you're not feeling your body, but you're just tied to the screen, not even connecting to another person, then you lose that sense of being able to empathize with the partner, the sense of being able to empathize with yourself, and to actually do it from a felt state, that then you lose touch to all the other rich sensations that you have, which are actually going to affect your body in a sensorial way much more than just your vision.
I actually remember years ago, typically we share this in the second half, but I think it's appropriate to share here. Years ago.
A little bonus there, guys.
A little bonus, yeah.
And ladies.
Being on a date, and the guy was amazing. He was this wealthy guy who owned an Italian restaurant in Manhattan. Took me around in his convertible. It was a full moon. We found a cellist playing in the streets. the whole thing was amazing. But when we got back to his place and it got time to get down, everything was cool up until penetration. And then when penetration happened, he completely dissociated. He was not there. His eyes glazed over and he was no longer there. I couldn't feel him. I could see that he wasn't even seeing me. And then I went, wow, this is crazy. And I actually stopped it and I decided to go home.
I've had so many partners tell me about, there's this moment where they look into their partner's eyes and it's like it gets hazy. It's almost like a cataract goes there and it glasses over and they're no longer there.
They're not there.
The body's just into this robot mode until orgasm happens, fall asleep, and then kind of come back to, and it's almost as if there was no consciousness.
I'm sharing that because we might typically think dissociation and numbness happens in the female body, but it's also happening in the male body. And it's important to understand the impact. It really has a negative impact on relationships. Relationships can fall apart. Plenty of our clients have come to us thinking their marriages were going to be over because it was an insurmountable problem where one of them could feel and really enjoyed and the other one just doesn't feel. And it was starting to become a huge problem. So
Well, before we get into what the effects of this has on the relational field, on the physical field, on the emotional field, as well as then what are some signs you can begin to pick up on, I think just to tee off of what you said there, that during that act, when penetration comes along, there normally is a sort of disassociation from yourself and the partner. And that's because we don't really have any examples healthy models, yes, to begin to emulate and feel. We as humans use limbic resonance, meaning that you learn so much from when your mother is suckling you and you are getting that touch and you're looking into the eyes of the mother and you're getting to learn how like the whole emotional circuitry
And the mirror
works.
neurons.
The mirror neurons. But when it comes to sex, we don't have that. In porn, it's a lot about friction and the visual again. It's made for the camera. It's about harder, bigger, faster. And
Yeah, the camera angles are never really like in the eyes. You don't really look into the eyes.
but also
Well,
the bodies have to
the
like
female
pull
eyes
away
maybe.
Maybe.
But
maybe.
the male eyes, like, never.
But then even then, it's normally not her eyes. It's her head rolled back and making all kinds of sounds. But the camera is also designed to really just focus more on what's happening between the genitals. So you don't actually stay close. You're actually having to keep separation.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really lend towards something that should be felt as opposed to something that is being simply performed. So when people then imitate that, it ends up using a lot of friction, which just from a sensorial place, that friction is going to create pain. And then as the body is not wanting to experience pain and you want to just pleasure your partner, you will literally begin to just focus on your partner's pleasure, or you're going to, thank goodness, the nervous system helps you out, numb out so that you can get through this. And okay, I'll just do this to be able to like pleasure my partner and
Or
enjoy
get it over with. A lot of people are like, I just get this over with.
Or for the guy, he's like, well, that's how I masturbate. So I don't feel anything now unless I do this. And so I'm just going to hurry up and just go ahead and go for my orgasm before my partner actually stops me from doing what I need to do by either losing the erection or by them having too much pain and me not being able to finish.
Exactly. Well, this is a good place to shift into our more explicit conversation.
Well, I think before we do that, though, let's give people a little tip of what they could do to be able just to start to get more in touch with their body. It's a really simple practice. And actually, this was developed as one of the best methods to help people that have body dysmorphia, people who don't really have an accurate image of their self based off of what they see even when they look into the mirror. And that's the ability to have an interoceptive awareness. And that means to feel yourself from the inside.
Yes.
And it's super simple. All you do is you take your hand, you place it over your heart, and you feel for your own heartbeat. When you can start to register your heartbeat going more internal, feeling it pulsing into the hand, this is key because normally touch is coming from the outside, even when we do it to ourselves. And the more that we can actually meet touch from our body outwards, then that interoceptive awareness comes online and we get more in touch with our body awareness as opposed to how we think it is that we look.
Yeah, that is an amazing practice. It can do a lot of other things as well, but just that first initial contact of, oh, I can actually sense my own heart. That's pretty cool. And the other amazing thing is when you start to sense someone else's heart.
Yeah.
And that heart connection is very powerful. Well, I'm ready to jump into some stories because I think that's the best way to model is to share some stories.
To join us for the complete and explicit version of the podcast, simply upgrade your membership and gain instant access.